welcome. This is Corey Angela. Welcome to the End of Slavery Summit. I'm here with a very special guest, Graham Wright. He also goes by the nickname Man Against the State on several different platforms. You can find him on YouTube. His website is managainstthestate.com. And he's also got an Odyssey channel where he has a lot more of his redone animations. That's how I found him. His animations are incredible. He really breaks down economic concepts and concepts of how the free world would look. And how things would get done. So we're going to be talking about that. Really interesting conversation. Could you introduce a little bit about yourself? Welcome. I'm glad to have found your works.
Yeah, so thank you for inviting me. So I'm Graham Wright. I've been a libertarian anarchist for 15 years now, since 2007. And we can go into my story of how I became a libertarian. Ron Paul was a very important part of that for me. And shortly after I kind of found Ron Paul and found my philosophical home and started learning a lot more about it, then I felt the need to kind of share what I'd learned with others. And that's when I started my YouTube channel, Man Against the State. I specifically wanted to explain a topic which I felt was not well understood among libertarian anarchists, which is how a free market legal system could work. So how could you have law without government? I found that a difficult question to grapple with when I was thinking about it. And I thought after I'd done all that research and got it kind of clear in my head, I thought I could explain it to others. And I started my YouTube channel specifically to do that. So that was my Law Without Government series, which I think was fairly successful. And I've had lots of feedback on that, people telling me it was quite helpful. And then from then on, my channel is mainly based on audio now. So the feedback that I had on some of my early videos was that people liked my voice, which surprised me. I wasn't expecting that kind of feedback, but they said that I have a nice voice to listen to and that I should try narrating audiobooks, which I did. So I then started uploading any kind of article or chapter of a book that I thought was really good and I wanted to share with people. I thought I'll make an audio version of it and just read it into my computer and then put it up on my channel. So I've got over 50, I think, on there now, of narrations of various things that have interested me over the years, and that's just become sort of my way of sharing stuff, really.
Yeah. And I feel like people really like animations. I've told you before, it really caught my eye. And the way you narrated it was, it was simple and it didn't need to be crazy, like complicated. It just got the point really clear. And like even the one where you have the alien who comes down to Earth and is asking questions like, what is government? Like it's a simple concept that you can do so much with. And I really thought that was a good idea. And you're right, your voice is amazing, by the way. And I think that's, as content creators, when we're first producing, we always get self-conscious, like, I don't like hearing my voice, I don't like seeing myself, but your voice is really good, I'd say, for narration and these types of things. So to the person who looks at a free world and looks at the word anarchy, they're like, oh my gosh, well, how would things work, without the state, and who will build the roads? What do you have to say to them?
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, it comes down to monopoly versus competition. In every kind of area, in every industry in the world, we've always got the same question. Do we want it to be run by a monopoly or do we want free market competition? And I was reading the economics and learning that kind of in general. And then it's just a case of applying it to every industry. It's like, well, should we have schools? Should they be run by a government monopoly or should we have free market competition? Well, the answer is always the same. It's always free market competition. And it's fairly easy to see that for something like schools or hospitals or even like roads. Maybe a little bit more difficult with roads, but then you go a layer down and you can go into the even more difficult ones, which are like security and military and law. Because it's like when I first was contemplating that, I was like, how on earth could you have law without government? It just seems such a bizarre concept to me when I first came across it. But it was, once I properly kind of learned the economics of it and learned how it applies to that specific industry, I suddenly realized not only can you have law without government, but it would be way better. The laws would be so much better if they're produced by a free market, which isn't really a surprising result because the free market does everything better than the government. Yeah. So it shouldn't be that surprising, but it does take a lot of kind of intellectual work to get your head around how could that possibly work.
Yeah, and so you mentioned law without government. I think, as somebody who talks about natural law, and a lot of the other people I've talked to, we talk about natural law. For us, looking at that type of law versus man's law, we can already deduce and say, well, there is something higher and more important to look at. But I like the way you also put it in the animation. You're like, there's multiple producers of law, and nobody is above the law to tell everyone else how everything should operate. Like, it was a really interesting way of looking at it, and you used like a simple line and putting a person above that line to represent like the law. Like, simple things like that for me synced in my mind, and I remember that. And I think for the person who's completely new to these concepts, that can make a pretty big impact. Like, you and I talked before about Larkin Rose. He did a video on the tiny dot. I mean, it's a literally it's a dot, but that one is one of his most successful videos. Meanwhile, he's
Mm.
got tons of other videos that are like double, triple in length that don't get nearly as many views because they're not like simple animations that really make people think about these concepts. So, what would you have to say about like the person who's like wants to apply communism and other forms of economics? Are you against that, or would you be open to that? How do you feel about people who think capitalism is the enemy?
Well, this was one of the reasons I wanted to make this law without government video, because the framework that I present there is indifferent to any particular system. It's not
Mm,
capitalist, it's not communist. It's just saying this is how it could work at a kind of macro level. And then within that, you can have all kinds of different legal systems operating at once. So, if you've got some communists that want to go and set up their own commune, they're welcome to do that. That kind of work, it fits within the kind of framework that I've outlined in that video. And then you can have different communities where you have different rules. So there's this kind of plurality of rule systems that can all kind of coexist together. We don't need kind of one overarching, these are the rules for the whole land or the whole world. You can actually have different communities doing their own things.
wow. Yeah, that's interesting. I like the way that you look at that because I look at it the same way. If people want to try something, and essentially you can look at it as sort of competition, but you can look at it as like people want to live their life as they want to live their life, as long as
Mm.
they don't use violence to coerce others against their will into saying this is the way it has to be, right? Where again they put themselves above the law, so to speak. Say I'm the producer of law, no one else is, type of deal.
Yeah.
So it's a voluntary relationship. I appreciate that because some people would have very strong views. They'd be like, no, I can't do this. And it's like, yeah, okay, that's your personal view, but like you get violence is still like we're still looking at morality here, past the economics. Some people want to look at just the economics, and I feel like it's not
Mm.
necessarily holistic without the morality, right? I don't know how you
Yeah.
feel about that, but just figured to put that out there. So, you have personal experiences as well, like with this belief system. You said, like, Ron Paul helped you get out of this. For a lot of people I talk to, Ron Paul is like the person, and it's amazing to me because he's not somebody who's necessarily professed in a lot of this stuff either. But he definitely questioned a lot of things, and
Mm.
because of that, I think it sparked so many light bulbs in everybody's heads that they started going on all these researching and finding out all these people who wrote all these books. And he's aware about a lot of things too. But like, was it really hard for you to get out of statism, this belief we call in government, in the fact that, oh, we need government to provide these services? Was it really hard for you to get out of that? Like, how long did it take? Because for me, it took some time. I had to ask myself questions. If I had your animations earlier on, I probably would have snapped out of it even quicker. But I had Larkin Rose's 5 questions. High Impact Flicks, he made a video on 7 questions, and those really stuck with me because I kept asking myself those questions. And then over time, I found videos like yours, and that just really helped encapsulate them.
Mm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, it definitely was very hard. I'd say I had the advantage of being quite apolitical up until 2007. So I wasn't like in my youth like a political activist type. So I didn't really have any kind of existing ideological commitments. I was just your typical statist, the product of the public schooling system. So I believed what everyone else believed. Um, I think what Ron Paul gave to me was the idea that you can have a philosophical basis for your political positions. I think up until that point, when I'd seen politicians, on TV, they all just kind of seem to be making up as they go along. There's no kind of consistency. They're saying what people want to hear, and there was no kind of system to it, and this is what made politics not appeal to me, I think, because I'm quite a systematic thinker, and seeing all these people just sort of coming up with policy on the fly, kind of ad hoc, with no consistency to it, turned me away. But then I saw Ron Paul, and when I saw there was this kind of movement building behind him on the internet, and I was kind of intrigued about how could one man sort of have that kind of effect that I've never seen a politician have before. But as soon as I saw his interviews and saw him on the debate stage, I got it straight away. I was like, oh yeah, now I understand why this man's so unique and so brilliant, because he's got a philosophy behind it, what he's saying. I disagreed with most things that he said when I was first watching those videos, but I could tell that he had good reasons for saying everything he was saying. So like, for example, healthcare, like as a standard Brit, I was very pro kind of government healthcare system. I was like, you crazy Americans with your free market system, you're insane. And I was listening to Ron Paul, and he was saying, we should have less government in healthcare. I was like, what? Less government in healthcare? That's not the way to go. But I could tell there was reasons why he was saying that, and he named names. He said, I think, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. He was talking about his the academics that had inspired him, and I thought, well, I need to go and read these guys. I need to go and read what they're saying. So I did that. I read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, which is very good, and The Road to Serfdom by Friedrich Hayek. Those two together I was reading, and I kind of suddenly come to the realization that I'd been all wrong about politics, and collectivism is not the right way of thinking about things. You need to think in terms of individualism, think of like individual rights, rather than thinking of the world as a war between groups, which is how sort of collectivists think. So then when I kind of understood the right way of thinking about things politically, and I started learning economics, I suddenly realized, oh yeah, Ron Paul is right about all these things that I thought he was wrong about. Of course he's right. We need free market healthcare. Of course I was wrong to think only the police should have guns, which is what I used to think before. And it's just, I now see the arguments. So I think probably from the time I first saw Ron Paul to the time when I was kind of calling myself a small government libertarian, probably only about 6 months. It didn't take me that long. It was the ethical argument that got me first, though. He was saying taxation is theft, which I thought was a very kind of strong statement. But then, you spend a few minutes thinking about it, and you're like, well, yeah, it is. Of course it is. It's taking money off someone at the point of a gun. What is that but theft? Of course that's theft. So then I was like, okay, well, taxation is unethical. And I was kind of really driven to kind of, right, we need less taxes, we need less government, from a kind of ethical point of view, because it's just wrong the way things are being done at the moment. And then I got to a key point where I was a kind of a minarchist. I kind of thought, let's get rid of the government out of all of these industries apart from 3. We need the government for courts, police, and military. That was the kind of my minarchist position, and that's where I got to with sort of Ron Paul and Friedrich Hayek, that line of thinking. And then there was a whole stage after that when I got from the small state libertarian to libertarian anarchist, which was probably about a year. And that was mostly grappling with law and how you can have polycentric legal systems and have the lack of a monopoly, and how that could work. So it really was, it was the ethics that drove me, but it was the economics that pushed me over the line, I think is how I would say it.
Yeah, because then you saw it like in action, like this is how it will work, because so many people like make all these justifications like, hey, well, if we don't have this, what about this? If we don't have this, it's a necessary evil, people say. I'm like, interesting, a necessary evil. And I just really run through these people's thoughts like, are you sure? Necessary evil. I mean, it's like we can say the same thing about the chattel slavery that occurred for over 4,000, 5,000 years, and everybody was okay with it, thought it was natural and normal to society, and, everybody thought it was necessary for the economy. and then all of a sudden it's like, wait, we don't need it, and cotton production's even better. It's like, what? And so it's like, it's because of the morality that we challenge these things, and then we realize it's not a necessary evil. If it's evil, we recognize it's evil. Why don't we find solutions? Especially now we have technology and way more innovation than ever, and what freedom allows us to have is more innovation than ever. I think it's incredible. So you mentioned police and military. I feel like this holds a lot of people back. So you said based on your own testimony, this is a topic that was pretty heavy. And I think even for me, it's like, if somebody expects me to describe how everything would look in a free world, it's like, am I really solely responsible for that? Like, what are you going to do when someone gets hurt? Are you just going to stand there and watch them? Like, you got to take some personal responsibility. I think that's part of the key to our freedom in the first place. But, like, a lot of people will say, well, we need someone to protect our assets, protect our rights. So what would you have to say about that, and how do we solve police and military problems?
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely understand that motivation. I feel like I need someone that's going to protect my property. If
Yeah.
somebody is invading my property, I definitely want someone to call that'll come and help me. That's a service that I value.
Mm.
But the question is, should that service be provided by a government, or should it be provided on the free market?
Mm.
And I think we can have that kind of thing on the free market. If there's demand for something, entrepreneurs will supply it, and they'll find the optimal ways of supplying it. People shouldn't get into the mistake of thinking that we either have a state or we have lawlessness. There's something in the middle of those two. There's law without the state. So it's not like it's either a state or it's chaos. There's actually this point in the middle where it's kind of optimized. So you can subscribe to a private security firm who will deliver you the kind of service you want. If you just want like an emergency number, I'm sure you'll be able to buy that as a kind of relatively cheap package. If you wanted patrols outside your house, or like a permanent bodyguard at your gate, or whatever, whatever level of security you want and you're prepared to pay for, there'll be someone on the market willing to provide that service to you. And then we'll get all the benefits of competition as well. So you're never going to get a situation where you have like police brutality. That only happens when you have a monopoly, because if you had competition, then they would lose customers if they were behaving like that. They would be shown up by their competitors, and then you'd vote with your money. You'd move it from an agency that you think's taking bad actions to an agency that's taking good actions. So you've got this kind of the pressure from the market to always improve and always deliver a better service. So if you're concerned about kind of security, you should be an anarchist, because security would be much better under anarchy.
Yeah.
People would be much safer.
Now, what about the argument, like, with people saying, well, let's say we free ourselves and we live in anarchy, but there's still China or these other countries that are still living in governments, therefore that justifies for some reason our slavery, but therefore, how will we protect ourselves against them, even though the Americans basically revolted against the British with like barely any good arms, like against the most powerful government in the world at the time? A bunch of farmers got together and said, we're going to revolt. Like, that's pretty amazing to me. But what would you have to say about like military invasions and stuff like that?
Well, yeah. So military is just kind of a variation on security. Military is just kind of security on a big scale, which does introduce a few problems around kind of public goods and free riding and things like that. But they're not insoluble problems. In terms of like an anarchist society living next door to a state with a dictator or something, I would say you're actually safer in an anarchist society than you are in a state society if you're living next door to a dictator. For one thing, because there's less incentive for a dictator to take over an anarchist society, because there's nothing really for them to take over. There's no state apparatus there for them to utilize. And usually when two states go to war, the winner takes over the apparatus of the loser. And then, that's like an empire. They just replace the previous rulers. But if you've got a society that has no rulers at all, there's no kind of apparatus of ruling for a dictator to take over. So there's less incentive for them to invade. And then if they do invade, your defense forces should be highly incentivized to defend your property, because that you're paying customers. You're going to really make sure that the customers aren't suffering from a potential invasion, and you're going to have lots of different agencies all joining the kind of fight, and it's not going to be kind of centrally controlled by one state. So you're not going to have like all your eggs in one basket. You're going to have lots of different agencies all trying to repel this invasion if it should ever happen. So it's again, it's a case of I think the market can do defense better than the state does defense.
Really good point. Like that perspective, I think, is really good, because you're saying like people recognize and they don't live with rulers. So even if people proclaim to say, I am your ruler now, it's not going to make a difference, because those people already recognize there's no need for rulers. There is no rulers. So you can't really change that. When people own themselves and they recognize that and they practice that, you can't really undo that unless you use, perhaps, I guess, a lot of violence upon that individual. But that would require that individual to submit, to surrender. And, I don't think people who want to be free, who are free, are going to want to give up their freedom so easily. I mean, that's the whole point of defending our rights and assets as such. And again, like you said before, sort of we have to look at it on an individual basis. When people make these justifications for these systems, they may not realize they're making a collectivist argument, right? Like, I want to violate the rights of the individual for the so-called rights of the collective. Like, what is that? We don't know. We can't really get clear as to what that is, and we can make tons of justifications. We have to be very careful. What would you have to say about the people who say, well, if government is just a monopoly and it's just a gang per se, well, wouldn't there just be another gang or a group of warlords who just take over? Is another thing people say.
Well, my answer to that is yes, there will be, if people still believe they need a ruler. If you shake off one ruler but you still think you need a ruler, then of course another one's going to pop up. So the way to prevent that happening is for people to reject the idea of being ruled anymore. I mean, it's like any other kind of barbaric practices from the past that we've kind of moved on from now. It's like, are they going to come back? Well, I mean, they might, like burning witches or something. Like, is that going to happen again? Probably not. But if people start believing in witches again, then yeah, it will. So there is a kind of a truth to that quote about eternal vigilance. You do kind of need to constantly make sure that nobody's going to rule over you. But the best possible starting place for that is to have anarchy, because there's nothing there at all for a potential tyrant to kind of get hold of. If you have a minarchist government, if you have courts, police, and military run by the government, I mean, that's like an open invitation for a wannabe tyrant. All they've got to do is take over the state, and then they can start, spreading their power and doing whatever atrocities they plan to do. Yeah. So you've got to kind of get rid of the state entirely, and there's nothing for them to do. They can become they can become rich. They become head of a powerful security agency, but they don't have any special rights. They don't have any special privileges from that. They're just an ordinary person. And if people are vigilant and they're looking out for this, they're going to keep an eye on these people that have kind of a lot of economic power to make sure it doesn't become political power, and make sure they don't go from being a head of a security firm to a government. Because that's the key point there, is when it becomes a monopoly. So you want to stop it before that point. And I don't think that would be a very difficult thing to do once you've got a society where people are no longer willing to put up with being ruled. I think it's going to be difficult to prevent a new ruler from happening. So you're the worst people in society would then just be petty thieves and thugs who don't have the law on their side, so they're relatively harmless.
And everybody sees them as wrong. They don't see them as morally legitimate for doing what they're doing.
Absolutely, yeah. That's the key difference with the state, really, isn't it? It's a gang of thieves with very good propaganda, because they've somehow convinced their victims that the gang is necessary, and that we steal for your own good, kind of thing. So they are very good at propaganda. They've convinced people they're legitimate, and without that, there'd be nothing.
Yeah, I really like the way you break this down. For me, it's really simple to understand. I know that somebody listening who may be new to all this and may not be as simple at first, especially if like you're new to these concepts, but I think when you understand them and you just like think about it, you start to realize like this is not at all really hard to grasp what we're saying. And I was telling you before, you know, it's like we're having a yard sale, you know, we're having farmers markets, stuff like that, where people are practicing voluntary exchanges, right? I mean, that right there is evidence of people coming together without the need of violence, people working together for products or goods that they need. And so I think that's really interesting. And then you also mentioned the fact of like education, and the need for that. And that's why, you know, we talk about statism. We identify it as a belief system, something that a lot of people have and struggle with, including ourselves. And we use ourselves as saying, like, this is a personal testimony to the fact that we ourselves struggled with that. And a lot of other people are, so it's okay. We're not special just because we came across that belief system where, you know, it doesn't make us morally superior. It makes us simply recognize something that we should have already, you know, something we should recognize as a human species. I think it's part of our evolution as humanity. And when we share that moral knowledge, it's probably going to get to other countries, especially with the technology and this mass communication, that if something is destined for humanity and it needs to get out there, then, you know, we follow that path and we follow it through. And that's why I really am inspired by the abolitionists in the 1800s, because they were like, we need to follow it, immediate abolition. You know, I don't care what you say. Media is censoring us. We're going to start our own newspapers. We'll start our own communities, even some of them. They're like, we're going to end slavery. Like, that's a good mentality to have. It may be very hard line. Some people may not like that. But it was understanding morality to the deepest sense. Like, these people are just like everyone else. That's it. No other justifications needed. No, like, bunch of, you know, words put on top of that. So I really appreciate that perspective. Any thoughts on what I just said?
Yeah. So I think, is that William Wilberforce who said, we don't think that we'll get to free society straight away, but that we ought to. We ought to get there as quickly as possible. I don't know, I've butchered that quote, but you know what I mean. And I feel the very same way about statism. You know, people might say to me, "Oh, you know, Graham, you shouldn't go around calling yourself an anarchist because it puts people off. You know, you should try and be a bit more gentle and just sort of advocate for for some free market reforms here and there, but try and like keep your credibility among people." And I just think that's a totally wrong-headed approach. I think I need to stand up and say, this is the ideal, this is where we want to get to. I know that there's a very long way from where we are, but I don't care. That's the destination, you know. And I don't know exactly what the roadmap is to get there, but all I can say is, you know, this is the end point. This is our vision. This is where we're trying to get to. You know, just like the abolitionists, you know, they wanted the end of slavery immediately, but they knew it wouldn't come immediately. In the end, they knew it would be a slow process, and it's the same with me. I think the state won't be just gone overnight. It will be a slow process, but boy, I wish I could make it go away overnight. You know, I'd push the button straight away.
Yeah, especially, you know, with over the last years, and people start to notice acts of tyranny, and they start to realize this is why government is feared throughout many centuries, and why so many people become even more complacent, not even you know, more rebellious necessarily, but more complacent, because they look up and say, well, oh my gosh, our government's going crazy, we need a new ruler, or oh my gosh, you know, this policy is bad, we need a new policy, and oh, where do we look to protect our assets? But they never really question anarchy. They never look at, is a free world possible, right? They don't ever question that, and I think to some extent it's because the resources were never there for them. The education. I bet most people have never even heard of the people you mentioned, you know, Ludwig von Mises and these guys. No one probably knows about them, but a lot more people are starting to come across them. I mean, because otherwise I wouldn't have met you and so many others, and I never expected to. But just because I was led down that path, I ran into all these people, and I realized that, yes, you know, there were people saying this stuff 200, 300 years ago. And were they listened to? No, not necessarily either. But they knew it. They saw it, and they looked toward the future as well. Like Lysander Spooner, right? For example, somebody I I look up to all the time, based on his writings. And of course, I don't put anyone on the pedestal, but I look at what he said and what he did, and incredible. Starting his own post office, getting, you know, shut down by the government post office, and then, you know, being an abolitionist, fighting on that front, and then fighting the Constitution while using it somewhat for the lawyers at the time to end slavery. Like, he was very strategic, and he knew both sides of the system.
Mm.
But he also knew what was needed for humanity. You know, a lawyer to call himself an anarchist in the 1800s. I mean, very interesting. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the work of the kind of 19th century anarchists and the abolitionists was very important, and it kind of, you can see it feeding into the work of 20th century philosophers like Murray Rothbard, who kind of had the advantage of Mises's economics, because Mises had kind of had shown, kind of re-established economics on a firm epistemological basis, and he'd shown that markets work a lot better than the state. And Rothbard was able to combine his insights with the insights of people like Lysander Spooner and their kind of anti-constitution arguments, and kind of bring it all together and kind of synthesize it into a kind of new anarchist system, a libertarian anarchist system. So Murray Rothbard was definitely, for me, it was a very important figure in my kind of path to libertarian anarchism. And yeah, he was very complimentary of all the individualist anarchists of the 19th century.
Mm. Yeah, and as you know, for me, Mark Passio was my influence, and they both share this thing they call natural law. But the reason why I think Mark Passio also appeals to so many people is because he really drills down those moral concepts, and just makes that the pin focal focus, even without all the detail on economics and everything. That is sometimes enough alone, because so many people sometimes have to address themselves and their own internal traumas and shadows. Some people call it the shadow work, to really reevaluate their life, to recognize self-ownership, because we realize, like, that's a step in the right direction. First of all, you need to realize you own yourself, to not, you know, own others, or to want people in control of other people. So it's like getting to that step can be difficult in a world where it's like you're, from day one, you're born into this world believing in these systems, right? And not seeing any other way out. So when we get out of the system, like you talked about education and bring that to more people's awareness, do you think voting or political action would be anywhat necessary? Because some people might think, yeah, well, why don't we still participate in elections and vote people? And what are your thoughts on that? And any other strategies to help with people's education of this knowledge?
Mm. Okay, well, I mean, trying to shrink the state from the inside is a foolish strategy, and that's never going to work. You know, you're never going to be able to get a good guy elected and then he repeals all the laws and you know, shrink the state that way. That's never going to work. But it would be wrong of me to dismiss politics entirely based on what I've said about Ron Paul. If it wasn't for Ron Paul, I wouldn't be here. And Ron Paul was running for president. He was playing politics. So for me to now say, you know, you should stay away from politics, have nothing to do with it, it would be a bit hypocritical, wouldn't it? Because it's like, well, clearly there was some benefit to Ron Paul doing that. And when you listen to Ron Paul talk about this, he'll freely admit that the 20 or 30 years he spent in Congress, he basically did nothing, like made no difference to the size of the state. He didn't really stop it from growing. He certainly didn't shrink it. Mm. But what he did was started a movement. He reached people. He got hearts and minds. So he used politics as a platform. He used it as an educational platform. He's quite open. That's what he was doing. He was running an educational campaign from the Republican debate stage. You know, he was up there telling us about the CIA blowback and the concepts like that, the gold standard, and talking about inflation tax. He was teaching us. He was like giving us a lesson in kind of how to think of these things. So if you're going to go into politics for that reason, then yes, I can say that might be beneficial, but I certainly wouldn't recommend it, because I think it's a cesspool. I'm in awe of how Ron Paul was able to kind of go to all those committees and you know, put up with all these terrible people around him all day and not be corrupted. It's really quite remarkable. So I don't think it's a very good life to get into politics. I don't think it's going to be very fulfilling or very rewarding. But if you do think it is kind of a platform for reaching people, then go for it. You know, I don't feel like I'm in a position to say no, given my background. But generally, I think there are better ways than politics of reaching out to people. You know, I think especially these days, people aren't really looking to politicians for their moral guidance, if they ever were. So I think you can reach people on the internet much more easily, and you don't necessarily need to go through kind of a mainstream political channel anymore. So you can reach people more directly.
Yeah, good point. So you would recommend people use sort of the internet to their advantage. Any particular resources, like when it comes to action, that you would recommend?
Well, I think the first thing before you get to action, you have to educate, don't you?
Hmm.
I mean, it's number one importance. I consider it my main responsibility just to educate myself. If I can educate others along the way, that's good.
Right.
But I think all of us, that should be our number one goal, is kind of is educating ourselves and each other. So I tend to focus on that side of it rather than kind of direct action. I mean, I'm not opposed to kind of agorism or, you know, counter economics or anything of that nature. You know, I fully support that. I think initiatives like the Free State Project, potentially good. You know, the idea of kind of a seceding territory sounds pretty good to me. I would kind of extend it further and hope you have kind of free counties within the Free State, and you know, eventually you'll get to zero government. So that's a potentially good project. What else is there? I mean, there's things you can do kind of if you're a parent, get your kids out of school. Schools are kind of where a lot of these problems start. That's where the indoctrination, the conditioning happens. So yeah, that's a good form of activism as well if you're a parent.
Yeah, these are great tips. Now, when it comes to educational resources, because you're right, I mean that does come first. Is there any particular books that you would recommend for people, like if they really want to understand everything that you're talking about, with like, you know, solutions to this problem or that problem? I know you mentioned some books before, but are there some that you think would be really helpful for the person who's new to a lot of this information that you'd recommend for the audience?
Okay, yeah. So there's one website you should go to. It's mises.org, mises.org. And it's an educational website, and there's so much resources on there. You can spend a lifetime reading all those books, all the lectures, and it's all free. You don't have to sign up for any of it, and it's all kind of academic based, mostly economics and political philosophy. And I've spent a lot of time on that website. And they have kind of daily articles as well as the kind of annual Mises University lectures, as well as conferences and things like this. So that's a really good source. I think I just kind of start from there, really. I mean, in any book by Ludwig von Mises or Murray Rothbard would be excellent. For a specific one, maybe For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard is very good. That was the one that kind of for me was quite influential, because that was the one that was really applying the economics to the areas that I hadn't seen it applied to before. So that was really important for me. So I look up any of the Austrian school economists or any kind of libertarians in that school of thought. That's what I'd recommend.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's totally awesome. I do agree. Like the Mises website is really cool. It has tons of resources. You'll find some articles I think on there. I think I found some from like 1900s. You know, like late 1900s, when a lot of that stuff was happening with Mises, when they were founded. You can still find articles that old from like 1970s, 1980s, I'm pretty sure, from the website. And they have like transcripts too of Lysander's work, Lysander Spooner, from the 1800s. So they compile a lot of great resources for people. That is a good recommendation, I would say. Do you have any animations planned, or anything that you think is something that, I don't know if you want to share, anything that you're working on that you ever need help with, or something that you are trying to pinpoint on, like you're focusing on moving forward? Now that you have all this knowledge, you know, what do you think is the right step moving forward for yourself, and sort of, you know, leading to the next world?
Yeah, I don't have any more animations planned. I don't have fond memories of those animation days. It's not for me. a bit too tedious for me. But yeah, I certainly do have other things in the pipeline. I'm remaking my Law Without Government series. There's the audio is not very good looking back. It was sort of 10 years ago that I made it, and I think I can do a much better job now. So I'm in the process of remaking that video, trying to make it shorter and clearer and better quality all round. So that's coming. And then I also I'm going to start a podcast very soon. So I've recorded the first couple of episodes with my friend Richard, and we'll be putting that out by the end of the year. We'll have a few episodes to put out there. That's going to be called Unapproved Opinions. And each week it's myself and Richard Tobin will be talking about one of our many unapproved opinions and trying to explain and justify them. We're both libertarian anarchists, and we have kind of lots of views that are kind of outside the mainstream. So this is our way of kind of putting our thoughts out there and trying to defend ourselves. So yeah, it's been really fun making it so far.
Awesome. Yeah, and if people are watching right now, it's possible that it's out right now, so be sure to check it out. When we mentioned the term anarchist, I figured I would also come to you with this question, because a lot of people will look at people that are wearing masks, on the street, burning buildings, and they're like, well, these guys call themselves anarchists, and they have the anarchy symbol, and are they really anarchists? Do you have some criticisms for those who call themselves anarchists out there?
Well, that's the caricature of an anarchist, isn't it? And I mean, look at it from the state's point of view. Of course, you're going to want to discredit anarchists. They're your enemy, aren't they? If somebody's saying that the state shouldn't exist, then the state's going to do all they can to make those people look crazy and unhinged. So yeah, you can certainly see the benefit to the state of having that image of anarchists. It's funny. I messaged a group of friends of mine the other day and I sent a picture of Murray Rothbard, and they hadn't seen him before. And there he was, an old man with a grin on his face and a bow tie. And the response came back is, it doesn't look like your typical anarchist. And I just thought that was brilliant, yeah, because the anarchist in the mind of the everyday person is throwing bombs or something. That's so true. I sent this picture of this kind of little old man with a bow tie on, and yeah, to me that is an anarchist though. It's a philosophy. It's something that you don't get to easily. You get to it through a philosophical reflection and a properly kind of thinking about things. So yeah, I'm an anarchist. I'm proud of it. I think the disconnect between kind of how I am, my sort of personality, and how I look, and then calling myself an anarchist, that kind of immediately kind of triggers people. They're like, "What? How does that make sense? How could someone like me call themselves an anarchist?" But I think it's because I'm doing philosophy. I'm thinking about it, and I'm working out the kind of the best answers based on my own kind of judgment and my own research.
Yeah, and I've even talked to some people who maybe they grew up pretty rebellious, because some people when they're really young they're pretty rebellious, and they may automatically from day one start questioning authority and going against different authority figures in their life, but they too, when they get older, they still have to recognize at some level there needs to be a philosophical basis for why people own themselves, and why it's important to express that through sovereignty and to what it means to work together and stuff like that. I mean, that's something everybody has to learn one way or another, whether they're they grow up rebellious or not. For me, I was extremely obedient. I mean, people would it's like, well, is this your rebellious stage? No, it's like this is me finding out, wait, I've been obedient all this time to the state, to everybody, and because I thought obedience was morality. That's what I was taught in the school system. But no, it's like I have my own mind. I can think for myself. So it doesn't have to be like that. Am I really being rebellious for thinking for myself? To live my own life without coercion? I mean, is that hard to ask? So I don't. It's very interesting, and again, if anybody's new to this knowledge, I welcome the questions. I welcome the challenge. We're not You know, we're not
Yeah.
saying you're crazy. We're not saying we're superior or anything like that. You know, it's like if we want a philosophical conversation, which I appreciate you for having, it's like we want to really just ask the questions and people can come to their own conclusions. We're not making anybody think a particular way or act a certain way. But guess who is? The
Yeah.
government systems that be, they're making you do what they want done for their own will, you know, for their own ego. So there's a big difference there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, is there anything you have to say about that, or
Well,
you know,
yeah, no, it's just really interesting to hear you say that you were particularly obedient when you were young, because I was just about to say the same thing. I was like that as well. I wasn't a rebel at all. I was
mhm,
very obedient. And I wonder if there is a connection there, because I think it's almost like my worldview. I kind of had total kind of faith and trust in the authorities and the experts, but then an event happened that made me realize they were wrong, and that's what caused me to throw out my whole worldview and to suddenly not trust anyone and suddenly not trust the experts anymore and to think for myself. So I do wonder if there's kind of an irony there, where the most obedient people in their youth actually are more open to becoming kind of radicals in this way, because once their kind of their faith in the authorities has been shaken, they realize, you know, you have to rethink things and you're going to have to reestablish your worldview, because what you thought before was wrong. That's you know, I think there's a connection there. I think it's not a coincidence that I was a particularly obedient youth and I've
mhm.
turned into someone who's now um, a rebel, I guess.
Right. I
Yeah.
think it also. Go ahead.
So it'd just be interesting if there were like many other people in the movement
Mm.
that kind of feel similarly about that, or whether there's kind of a contingent of people that were kind of always rebels. I'm not really sure. I mean, you probably know more people kind of around the movement than I do, so I don't know if
Yeah.
that's ever come up before.
Well, I don't think a lot of people always say, you know, I was super obedient necessarily, but they'll say, you know, I participated in this, I participated in that. You know, I think it depends because the childlike spirit, when you know, when we're very young, we want to question things, we want to explore, we want to be adventurous. You know, I think it's in all of us to some extent, right? But I would say that for me, and while I can relate to you on the obedience factor, for me, it's like, well, what if you just put your obedience somewhere else, right? I mean, think of the abolitionist, and I have a book from 1973 that a lot of people don't have by historian Lewis Perry, and it's called Radical Abolitionism, Anarchy in the Government of God and Anti-Slavery Thought. And basically, it shows that the abolitionists were using the government of God as sort of the justification to get rid of human forms of government and human forms of authority. So if you see something higher than these man-made artificial things, you start to realize there's something that applies universally and timelessly to all human beings that is sort of like destined for us. So when I look at natural law or nature, you know, as opposed to man, I think that was the direction that led me toward a perhaps a better obedience, right? And it's not really a type of obedience that we would call obedience because I'm not being obedient to man, but I'm being obedient to truth.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's the way for me how I sort of got out of that. I'll be honest.
yeah. Okay, that is an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, because yeah, I do certainly obedient to truth would be a good way of describing how I feel as well. I do feel like truth is my guiding light. You know, it's that's what I seek out, because I realised that what I was brought up on was mostly lies. So kind of I hold the truth in great value. So I kind of seek it out wherever. And if somebody's saying I'm wrong about something, it kind of it deeply concerns me. You know, I don't like to think that I'm wrong about something. You know, if somebody disagrees with me, I have to research it well enough so that I know either they're wrong or I change my mind, and that's, you know, and then I've learned something as well. So yeah, definitely, there's an obedience to truth is definitely something I feel I have as well.
And that's why I encourage, you know, people to question things because for me, like you just said, like if somebody says I'm wrong, I want to improve and I will
Mm.
question myself like, am I wrong? I'm not gonna be like, my first reaction is not gonna be like, well, I'm right. What are you talking about? Like, no, I'm gonna sit down with myself and I'm like, am I wrong? And I ask myself that all the time. I still constantly reflect, like, am I wrong? And it's not to doubt myself. It's to question, like, is there room for improvement? Is there something I'm not seeing that I still need to see? And
Mm.
with economics and how things will get done, I think there's always something to see. It's like, because there's a whole world potential of future out there with freedom. There's so many things you can do with freedom, and I think that's the beauty of it. The fact that there isn't one way of handling scenarios, or there isn't one way of people finding the truth. There isn't one way of anarchism. I mean, it's sort of artistry, and I also think that's also a cool perspective. I've talked to people who are musicians, and there's a lot of people who produce music who are very passionate about it, in this movement, may you say, that care about freedom. And that's another way it gets to them. They listen to music and has sometimes these really powerful lyrics, and they find it through there, you know?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I mean, the kind of the artistic side, I think, is really important. Yeah, to have musicians and artists associated with the kind of the truth side of things is really good. Yeah, to counter all these kind of establishment, not let them dominate the arts. I think that's it's part of the fight.
yeah. All right, so we're reaching about the hour point now, and is there any extra resources or anything else you'd like to mention you feel like we haven't yet covered, that you want to share with the audience, before we go?
Well, no, I think we've covered my channel, Man Against the State, and my new podcast, Unapproved Opinions. That'll be at unapprovedopinions.uk, which isn't live yet, but it will be live in the next couple of months. So hopefully by the time this goes up, your viewers will be able to check out some of my unapproved opinions and watch some of my videos there.
Awesome. Hey, man, keep up the great work. I love your channel. I was always thinking about reposting your videos. I got your permission to repost the one about libertarians being abolitionists, because that's a term that I sort of brought back for my own personal use, because I just think it's important to look at the morality of things. And I also use the word anarchist here and there. It depends. I like using both, to show, like, this is a connection that could be made, as some of the abolitionists did themselves. So you look up online, they'll call themselves no governmentists, like, the other ways of saying it. I was like, okay, that's interesting. But yeah, I appreciate your works and everything you're doing, and your audiobooks too are really cool in detail, and you have a great voice. I hope you continue doing what you're doing, and I look forward to seeing more content. I recommend everybody checking it out. managainstthestate.com, managainstthestate.com, and again, you can find a lot of his stuff on YouTube and Odyssey. It's also just Man Against the State. Thank you, Graham, for joining me, and everybody for watching. If you want to see a lot more speakers like this and also get a ton of resources for free, you can go to nita.one/summit, nita.one/summit. This is the end of Slavery Summit. Thank you, everybody. Take care.